Good evening. It's Thursday, January 12th. Welcome to a new episode of System Update, our new live nightly show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively here on Rumble, the free speech alternative to YouTube. Tonight, we will cover an amazing story that is at once one of the funniest episodes in Washington in years, but also one full of all sorts of vital lessons on how the Washington establishment abuses its secrecy powers. Just 4 months after the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago and the Democrats thought they really had Trump this time because he had classified documents which the FBI insisted were recklessly and insecurely maintained, Biden's own Attorney General Merrick Garland was forced today to appoint a special counsel to investigate whether Joe Biden acted criminally, because every day seems to bring new stories about all the different places Biden seems to have recklessly left, not just classified material, but top secret documents. We will, to be sure, enjoy with you the multi-pronged ironies of the story, but also use it to explore these vital and oft overlooked tactics that your government uses to abuse its own secrecy powers by punishing whistleblowers who reveal the truth about them, while immunizing DC's most powerful actors for far worse transgressions of leaking classified information to deceive the public. For our interview segment, we will speak to the independent journalist I regard as the nation's single most knowledgeable reporter on Russiagate, Maté, about all of this, and also how and why Democrats unanimously are attempting to shield the FBI, CIA, and Homeland Security from investigative scrutiny by the Congress. As always, as soon as we're done here with our 1 hour live show on Rumble, we will move to Locals for our interactive after show to take your questions and comment on your feedback. To obtain access to our after show, simply sign up as a member to our Locals community. The red button is on the upper right-hand corner of the Rumble page. For now, welcome to a new episode of System Update, starting right now. President Joe Biden appears to have such a fondness for carelessly tossing classified documents in so many different places, kind of like a happy-go-lucky Santa Claus, playfully hiding the nation's secret in fireplace stockings so that you never know what you might find when you wake up and see some CIA or Homeland Security documents, that at this point, the more relevant question is not where has Biden strewn classified documents, but rather, where hasn't he left them? The story of Joe Biden and the fact that he has so recklessly handled classified information to the point that his own Attorney General Merrick Garland was forced to appoint a special counsel earlier today to investigate the president for possible criminality just a couple of months after appointing one to investigate Donald Trump for the same thing, has many interesting lessons to it about government secrecy and the way Washington leaders abuse and manipulate classified documents. And most of our show tonight will be devoted to examining those really crucial lessons. But we would be remiss and dishonest, as well as I think unfairly depriving you of important entertainment, if we did not confess that this entire episode, given everything that was said about Trump just a few months ago, is one of the funniest things to happen in Washington in months, if not longer. One can almost physically feel the visceral pain of corporate media outlets as they have to report on what happened here, knowing that there's really no way to excuse Joe Biden for what he did and differentiate it meaningfully from what Trump is said to have done. Or at least they haven't been given that way yet by the Biden White House. All week long, more and more stories have emerged about not just classified documents, but top secret documents left by Joe Biden in all sorts of unsecured locations. Today was the most embarrassing one yet, as the CNBC headline notes in a very dry tone, as though this is completely surreal and bizarre, quote, President Biden had classified documents in the garage of his Delaware home. The article explains, quote, classified government documents from the Obama administration were found in a storage space in the garage of President Joe Biden's Delaware home, Biden said Thursday. The disclosure of that latest discovery comes 3 days after Biden's special counsel, Richard Sauber, confirmed media reports that attorneys for the president found a first batch of classified documents from the Biden administration on November 2nd in an office that Biden had used as a private citizen at a Washington think tank. At a White House briefing earlier this afternoon, Biden was asked about all of this by one of the only reporters in that press room who has been willing to ask hard questions of the Biden administration Fox News' Peter Doocy. Doocy wanted to know, quite reasonably I would suggest, why Biden decided to leave classified documents in his garage. And here, in all of its coherent glory, is Biden's defense.
Mr. President,
Okay.
classified material next to your Corvette. What were you thinking?
Let me, look, I'm going to get a chance to speak on all this, God willing, soon. But as I said earlier this week, people, and by the way, my Corvette's in a locked garage, okay? So it's not like you're sitting out in the street.
So
but anyway,
was in a locked garage.
Yes, as well as my Corvette. But as I said earlier this week, people know I take classified documents and classified material seriously.
So the rest of that was him then reading, after talking about his Corvette, from a notebook that had been given to him, written by his lawyers with the talking points. But I've watched that part of that video that we just showed you at least 10 times today, in part because it's incredibly hilarious listening to Joe Biden talk about his Corvette and where it's kept in this locked garage. But also it's very difficult to try and make sense of what he is saying, how he thinks this helps him. And as best as I can discern, having listened to this many times now, is that what Biden seems to be saying is the following. Look, you guys know how much I love my Corvette. I love my Corvette. So, of course, I'm not keeping my Corvette just any place, like out on the street, for anyone to come and take it. I only keep my Corvette in an incredibly secure place, my locked garage. So, therefore, given how you know how much I love my Corvette, you must know that I would only keep my Corvette in an extremely secured location, and that should be convincing comfort to you, that when I kept my those top secret documents in my garage at my house, that was a really secured location because I even keep my Corvette there, the thing I love most in the world. So apparently, all of this incredibly expensive technology that the United States government develops and pays for in order to maintain secrecy around the most sensitive documents that it has. We tried to build one of those rooms at The Intercept to protect the Snowden archive. We copied the government's manual for how to build rooms that are designed to protect classified information. They're incredibly expensive and complex. Apparently, Biden is saying, all you need to do is just stick them in a garage, and as long as you have a little lock on a garage, everyone knows no one can break into a garage in a house. Not the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or terrorist groups who might want to get the most sensitive documents that happen to be laying on the floor of Biden's garage. He seems to be saying, look, you don't need all that whole complex thing that we spent all this money on. Don't worry, I keep it in my garage where my Corvette is, and it's locked. Now, the fact that this is the third time this week that we have heard about new places where Biden has decided to just kind of leave top secret documents laying around has made it impossible even for our press corps to defend Joe Biden, especially because we were subjected to months of melodramatic warnings about the peril the nation is placed in when a president like Donald Trump keeps secret documents in an unsecured location at Mar-a-Lago. And as a result, this pressure just was too much. This kind of cognitive dissonance was too much, even for our culture, political culture that is willing to sustain extreme amounts of double standards when it comes to the two parties, that Biden's attorney general decided today that given that he was forced to appoint a special counsel to investigate Donald Trump for this, there was no way out of him doing the same for Joe Biden. And as a result, he appeared today in the Justice Department and made this announcement.
Good afternoon. I'm here today to announce the appointment of Robert Hur as a special counsel pursuant to Department of Justice regulations governing such matters. In keeping with those regulations, I have today notified the designated members of each House of Congress of the appointment. I'm joined today by John Lausch, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, who conducted the initial investigation into the matter that I will describe today. On the evening of November 4th, 2022, the National Archives Office of Inspector General contacted a prosecutor at the Department of Justice. It informed him that the White House had notified the archives that documents bearing classification markings were identified at the office of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement, located in Washington, D.C. That office was not authorized for storage of classified documents. The prosecutor was also advised that those documents had been secured in an archives facility. On November 9th, the FBI commenced an assessment consistent with standard protocols to understand whether classified information had been mishandled in violation of federal law. On November 14th, pursuant to Section 600.2b of the Special Counsel Regulations, I assigned U.S. Attorney Lausch to conduct an initial investigation to inform my decision whether to appoint a special counsel. Mr. Lausch has served as the U.S. Attorney in Chicago since 2017. Before that, he spent more than a decade as an assistant U.S. Attorney in that same office. I selected him to conduct the initial investigation because I was confident his experience would ensure that it would be done professionally and expeditiously. On December 20th, President Biden's personal counsel informed Mr. Lausch that additional documents bearing classification markings were identified in the garage of the president's private residence in Wilmington, Delaware. President Biden's counsel informed Mr. Lausch that those documents were among other records from the period of the president's service as vice president. The FBI went to the location and secured those documents.
So, in other words, Joe Biden is currently under criminal investigation for whether or not he violated federal law in his mishandling, recklessly or deliberately, of some of the nation's most valuable secrets. Now, this is not a story that I would really generally care about for reasons I'm about to explain. In particular, everything in Washington is classified, and that's a very serious problem for reasons that I'm about to describe. But what makes this story so unbelievable is that after 5 years of Democrats insisting that they were this close to getting Donald Trump this time, to getting him in prison where they know he belongs, the walls are closing in. We heard over and over, this is the case where they really thought they had him because it's such a simple and easy case. There were classified materials that you're not allowed to take. If they're still classified, you have to store them only in authorized facilities. Mar-a-Lago is not an authorized facility. Therefore, Donald Trump's taking them there was a violation of the law. Clear, open and shut case. Democrats thought that they'll allow them to charge him with a crime and get what they really want, which is Trump being convicted and rendering him ineligible to run again. The problem that they ran into, however, is that Joe Biden appears to have done exactly the same thing, except he didn't just keep them in one unsecured place, but multiple ones, including the garage of his house where his Corvette is kept. Now, there's also a little other problem for the Democrats, which is that Donald Trump, as president, actually had the right not only to take classified documents, but he really could just declassify them at any time for any reason. There's no checks on the president's power to declassify documents. So Trump at least has the excuse, implausible though it might be, probably enough to create reasonable doubt in a jury though, that before he took them, he kind of magically said, all these documents are hereby unclassified, which he has the right to do, and therefore taking them is no longer a crime. Biden didn't have that right, however. These are not documents that Biden took while president. These were documents that came from Biden's time as vice president. He doesn't have the right to declassify these documents, and therefore he doesn't even have the defense that at least is available to Donald Trump, albeit a very weak defense. So let's look now back at what Democrats and their media allies and even Joe Biden himself were saying just a few months ago about how there's very few things more dangerous and more reckless and more disturbing than a high political official in Washington who fails to properly secure classified information. And I confess that one of the hard parts of preparing this show is that there are so many amazing videos like this that it was very hard to leave some out. We had to because we only have an hour show, but I'm going to show you what I think are the best ones. So let's start first with CNN, and they invited on their employee, James Clapper, the former senior national security official to President Obama. He served as the director of national security. Here he is talking to Aaron Barnett about the evils of being reckless with classified materials.
We can infer, though, and I can, as a longtime practitioner in the intelligence business, some profound concerns about who had access to these documents, where were they, and were they exposed to anyone who didn't understand the import of them and didn't protect them. So there's an audit trail that needs to be run, and I'm sure is being run, about the whereabouts of these documents from the time they left the White House and who potentially had.
My God, I don't often agree with James Clapper, but I have to say in this case, I really agree with him. It is deeply concerning when a president or a high official takes classified material and fails to secure them. The question is, who might have access to those? Like the Russians or terrorist groups, or maybe a member of your family who is in desperate need of money and therefore needs to get some money, perhaps by taking them. And here's one of the things we learned today from reporting from Real Clear Politics. There you see it up on the screen, quote, Hunter Biden had access to the garage where his dad kept his Corvette and classified material. Hunter Biden, as we know, is somebody who has been in extreme amounts of debt because of his drug problems, his drug addiction that he's been very candid about. He's someone who has often been very desperate for money for all kinds of reasons. And apparently, he had access to the garage where Joe Biden improperly kept these materials. As James Clapper warned, one of the gravest concerns when a president fails to keep classified material properly is who has access to it and what might they do. Here's what the reporting revealed. Quote, shortly after the White House announced that a second set of classified documents from the Obama administration was discovered in the Delaware home of the president, and immediately before Attorney General Merrick Garland announced the appointment of a second special prosecutor into misplaced classified presidential papers, Joe Biden tried to reassure the country by telling reporters that these sensitive documents were behind locked doors. Quote, yes, as well as my Corvette, Biden told Peter Doocy of Fox News. You just watched that. The White House has not revealed who, other than Biden himself, had access to the documents found in Delaware or the classified intelligence discovered by the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. But his son, Hunter Biden, who was under federal investigation for tax fraud and whom House Republicans plan to subpoena in regard to his foreign business dealings, did have access to the garage and therefore to these improperly stored classified materials, at least according to earlier statements made by Biden. As vice president in 2016, Biden and his Corvette appeared in the season premiere of CNBC's Jay Leno's Garage, showing off the classic that was a wedding present from his father. Biden told Leno that his sons had restored the vehicle to showroom condition. Quote, my two sons, Bo, who passed away, and my son Hunter, decided as a Christmas gift to have the engine rebuilt for me, he explained. That is a very touching story, but it's also very disturbing in light of the warnings that we just heard from James Clapper about the fact that one of the big problems when it comes to people maintaining classified information in an unsecured location is we never know who might have access to them. In this case, Joe Biden's deeply troubled and in-debt son appears to have been somebody who might have gotten a hold of them. That is very alarming. Another person who was extremely alarmed about Donald Trump keeping classified information in an unsecured setting was someone who used to be on the House Intelligence Committee. He was, in fact, the chairman. Unfortunately, he no longer is on that committee. He's been stripped for serial lying by the new House Republican majority. But when Adam Schiff was on the House Intelligence Committee and spoke with such authority about the sacredness of the sanctity of classified information, even though he was leaking classified information almost every day to CNN, here's what he said about how disturbed he was on Face the Nation.
Well, all I know about the actual materials is what was in that search warrant inventory. But from that alone, you can tell there was a serious risk to disclosure potentially of sources and methods, because some of those documents were marked top secret, sensitive, compartmented information. That is among the highest designation in terms of the extremely grave damage to national security that could be done if it were disclosed. So the fact that they were in an unsecure place that is guarded with nothing more than a padlock or whatever security they had at a hotel is deeply alarming. And I have asked for, along with Chairman Maloney, a damage assessment by the intelligence community and a briefing to Congress.
Deeply alarming this was. I mean, after all, these were top secret documents secured by nothing more than a padlock, like the kind that you might put on your garage where your Corvette is kept. Deeply, deeply alarming, said Adam Schiff about where these classified materials were at Mar-a-Lago. Now let's look at this next video. It is from...
obvious, Joe.
It is from Morning Joe. They were... This whole group of people here, not a lot of diversity here, but they were extremely upset, worried, and concerned about where Donald Trump was keeping these materials. Let's listen to what they have to say.
The obvious, Joe, is that Hillary Clinton's emails. Yes, we asked a lot of questions. But there's a far cry between her emails and the documents we're talking about that were removed in boxes and taken to a country club.
You're talking about
put in the basement.
False equivalency. If any member of Congress, if any ambassador, if any member of the intelligence agency had taken this many documents out, they, like I said, they would be in jail.
Oh, they would? So, I'm sorry, what was that? Where would people take classified materials and just like stick them in their house? Where would they be? What did he say at the end? I think he said in jail. That's where such people would be. Does he still think that now that Joe Biden is one of the people who actually did that? Let's look at what Joe Biden himself had to say upon learning that Donald Trump had secured material or failed to secure classified material in an insecure setting on 60 Minutes. He commented as well.
When you saw the photograph, of the top secret documents laid out on the floor at Mar-a-Lago, what did you think to yourself, looking at that image?
How that could possibly happen, how anyone could be that irresponsible. And I thought, what data was in there that may compromise sources and methods? By that I mean names of people who helped, or et cetera. And it just totally irresponsible.
When he learned that Donald Trump had just like secret documents on a floor in an unsecured setting, he was sick to his stomach. It was horrible. How could anyone possibly do something like that, said Joe Biden 4 months ago, before it was revealed that he went around just sprinkling classified material all over the place the way that some kind of parent would at their son's birthday party sprinkle little sprinkles on top of a cupcake. I got to listen to that again. Please let's watch Joe Biden again and hear about how he reacted when he learned that Donald Trump had kept top secret material in an unsecured location. Let's put that one up.
When you saw the photograph of the top secret documents laid out on the floor at Mar-a-Lago, what did you think to yourself, looking at that image?
How that could possibly happen, how anyone could be that irresponsible. And I thought, what data was in there that may compromise sources and methods? By that I mean names of people who helped, or et cetera. And it just totally irresponsible.
Totally irresponsible. I mean, we just don't know what kinds of information these materials might have, like sources and methods, the names of secret agents, perhaps. So CNN this morning had a very pained segment where Don Lemon and others had to discuss this story. You know, it was the last thing they want to do. You can see the indigestion because they haven't been yet given the way that they're supposed to defend the White House. So for the moment, all they're allowed to do is describe what happened. And they actually ended up including some pretty interesting information in light of everything that we just heard, especially from Joe Biden. Let's listen to this report from CNN.
With the fallout from the second batch of classified documents found by President Biden's legal team at a separate location used by Biden after his time as vice president. It presents a growing political crisis for the president and for Democrats. The latest revelation fueling Republicans' claims that Donald Trump is being targeted, receiving unfair treatment as he's being investigated by a special counsel over classified material found at Mar-a-Lago. It is a huge opening for the new pro-Trump House majority, now poised to investigate Democrats, though insist that Biden and Trump cases are not one and the same. CNN's Paula Reed live in Washington. Paula, it was a different story yesterday, a different story the day before, and now here we go again. It is growing. What do we expect to know about these documents in this second batch? What are we finding out?
Well, we don't know much, and part of that is because the White House is making a strategic decision not to get out in front of this matter, and as you saw at the briefing there, not to answer questions and instead to let things leak out through the media. Now, here's what we've learned from our reporting, and that is that Biden attorneys have found a second set of documents that include classified information at a second location. The first location, of course, was an office here in D.C. As we've reported, Biden's lawyers were clearing out that office back in November and uncovered what we've learned were 10 classified documents, including information about Ukraine, Iran, and the United Kingdom, and those included top secret documents. Now,
let's just stop there because that's kind of an important thing that she just acknowledged. She said, first of all, these were not just any classified materials. You see on the screen there, the CNN bullet points, that they were top secret materials, some of the highest level secrecy. And it included information these top secret documents found in Joe Biden's various unsecured locations where, for whatever reason, he liked to have documents, classified documents, strewn about. Information about Ukraine, Iran, and the United Kingdom. That sounds like it could be pretty valuable to a lot of people, of interest to a lot of people, including his son Hunter, who we know had access to the garage where these materials were kept, because remember, Hunter Biden was paid $50,000 a month to sit on the board of a Ukrainian energy company because of his extraordinary expertise in understanding how the energy sector works. No, of course that's not the reason. It was paid $50,000 a month in order to have influence with his father in order to get things done that were needed to be done by Burisma. And so here you have top secret documents being stored in a place that you know Hunter Biden had access to about Ukraine as well as Iran and the United Kingdom, the very country paying him to exert influence on behalf of Burisma. Remember, as Joe Biden said, his gut was opened up. It was gutting for him to hear that Donald Trump had not just classified material, but top secret material on the floor at his hotel, because who knows what documents what might be revealed by those documents and who might have access to them. Well, that's exactly the kind of documents that even CNN had to admit today were kept by Joe Biden in his garage. Now, Democrats, as I said, are really struggling to the point where you almost kind of feel sorry for them. I mean, after all, it's not easy to try and find a justification, but that doesn't mean they're not trying. Here, for example, is one of the efforts made today. I would give this a B- or a C+. It's from, the law professor, Jonathan Turley, is the one who reported it. It's from Hank Johnson, the Georgia Democrat, where Turley reported, quote, Hank Johnson and others believe the classified Biden documents were planted. It wasn't Joe Biden who took them. They were planted by enemies of the Democratic Party. Quote, alleged classified documents showing up allegedly, that's two allegedlys, alleged classified documents showing up allegedly in the possession of Joseph Biden. Things can be planted in places and then discovered conveniently. That may be what has occurred here. So apparently some unknown person got access to Joe Biden's classified material, took them, then got access to the think tank in Washington with which he's associated and his super secure garage where he keeps his Corvette, and planted these documents in order to frame Joe Biden. We're only, I predict, a day away from hearing that it was the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin who were the ones responsible for planting these documents, Democrats are already in the furthest field of conspiracy theories. Now, as I said, there's a lot of hilarious aspects to the story, some of which we just covered, but there's a couple of lessons that I think are not hilarious at all, but really quite important that I want to draw from this episode. And it has to do with the way in which Washington completely abuses its secrecy powers in the most selective and manipulative way to subvert every conception of democratic values. Now, when, as you know, I reported on the Edward Snowden archive, and the Edward Snowden archive was a series of files of hundreds of thousands or more of top secret, classified, and secret documents. Every single document in that archive was marked either top secret, classified, or secret, which made it, by definition, illegal for anyone to disclose them who was authorized to have them in the first place. So every document that bears that label, secret, top secret, or classified, automatically makes it a crime to give it somebody who's not authorized to receive it, including journalists. And there were some incredibly sensitive and important documents in that archive that enabled us to do reporting that opened a lot of eyes around the world about the true role that the United States plays under President Obama and the mass spying that were done. Here's just a couple of examples. The first article we did from The Guardian in June of 2013 that revealed that the FISA court had ordered Verizon to turn over all phone records of every American to the NSA. It subsequently, we reported, was every phone company. So the NSA was gathering about not American citizens believed to have engaged in criminality or connected to terrorism, but every American in mass, indiscriminately. The NSA was collecting your phone records so they know who you were calling, who was calling you, for how long you were speaking, where it was that you were. Incredibly revealing information. Imagine you call a certain kind of doctor or a psychiatrist or an abortion clinic, or you call an HIV doctor who specializes in HIV, or you speak with somebody who isn't your wife or husband late at night very often, or you call services to help with addiction. Being able to know with whom you communicated gives the government incredible amounts of information about who you are, what you do, and what your personal life consists of. And that's the information we were able to reveal through this archive that the government was collecting. That was marked top secret because the government didn't want anyone to know they were doing that. Here's another example from June. We reported on something called the Key Score program, where the NSA basically has a program that allows it to search your browsing history, to search for your chats, to search by keyword, pretty much every single thing that you do online. That was obviously an important story. We were able to report on the NSA's mass and indiscriminate spying on allied countries, including Brazil. We were able to report on the way in which the Biden administration had increased the amount of surveillance technology it gives to Saudi Arabia, one of the most tyrannical governments on the planet. And then we were able to report on how the NSA had a partnership with Apple, Google, and others to turn over enormous amounts of information. So a lot of the documents in this archive that were marked top secret were, in fact, very sensitive programs. But what struck me the most about this archive, and to this day we've only revealed or disclosed or published a small percentage of it, and people often ask why. One reason is because Edward Snowden insisted that we not publish material that might endanger people's lives. Another is that he insisted we not publish material that can invade people's privacy. So there's stuff in that archive about the NSA speculating that someone might be a terrorist. We're not going to publish that and destroy someone's reputation and attach the word terrorist to them, even though they've never been charged with that crime. There's summaries of people's private conversations that would invade their privacy if we were to publish it. So there's a lot of reasons we wouldn't publish the whole archive. But a major reason is that a lot of these documents are just incredibly banal. They're uninteresting. And yet they're still marked secret or classified or even top secret. I'm talking about things as banal as instruction booklets at the CIA on how to request vacation days, or how the NSA tells people to get their parking credentials or the menu for food that they can select. And the fact that so many documents, in fact, every document automatically in Washington gets marked classified or top secret or secret, and therefore it's illegal to disclose it, reveals something I think extremely important about how our government is working. Namely that everything the government does is presumptively secret, to the point where they just stamp everything they do with a label that makes it illegal for anyone to find out what they're doing. They've built an impenetrable wall around what they do that makes it impossible for the citizenry to see into what the government is doing. Now, if you think about what a healthy democracy would be, it would be the opposite. Everything that public officials do, which is why it's called the public sector or public officials, is supposed to be public, with very few exceptions. Obviously, there are things that they have a right to keep secret. Grand jury investigations, things that they're planning with the military, the names of agents that they have out in the field. Of course, there's things they can legitimately keep secret, but that's supposed to be the exception. So presumptively, everything should be transparent. We should know everything they're doing, except in the rare cases when they have the right to keep things secret. But they've completely reversed this so that instead, everything is presumptively secret. Everything in Washington is classified. Everything is secret. Everything is top secret. And that's why I really didn't care about the story about Trump having top secret or classified documents in Mar-a-Lago, because I know from experience, not just with the Snowden file, but with the WikiLeaks archives I've worked with, where I saw the same thing, that so many documents that are completely irrelevant or trite or banal are marked secret and top secret all the time, because our government has reversed the presumption of a healthy democracy that instead of having everything presumptively transparent and public, instead it's presumptively secret. And what makes that particularly disturbing is that at the very same time that they've built this wall of secrecy around what they do, they learn everything about what the citizenry does. So while the government is supposed to be presumptively transparent, we're supposed to know everything about what they do, they're supposed to know nothing about what we do as private citizens. That's why we're called private citizens. Our lives are supposed to be private. The government's not supposed to be monitoring us or surveilling us. They're not supposed to know anything about us. We're supposed to know everything about them. Instead, they've built this mass surveillance system where almost everything we do is under a framework of surveillance. So again, there are exceptions. Sometimes the government is supposed to be able to monitor us. They go to a court, they get a warrant. They prove that it's likely we're involved in a crime. They get a warrant to listen on our conversations, read our emails. But that's supposed to be the exception. The rule is supposed to be that everything we do is presumptively private. That's how a healthy democracy works. The citizenry knows what the government is doing. The government knows nothing about what the citizenry is doing, except in rare cases. In Washington, it's the exact opposite. We know nothing about what they do. They operate behind a wall of secrecy. They know everything about what we do because they've constructed a system of mass surveillance. Think about how disturbing that is, that we can't see into what they're doing and they can see into everything that we're doing. And that's one of just many reasons why it's so crucial to have the kind of committee like the Church Committee that the House Republicans are planning, that Democrats are unanimously opposing, to find out how it is that they're doing this. So that's one point I wanted to bring out from this. But there's another one, which is the way in which Washington manipulates secrecy powers is hard to overstate. Essentially what they do is they release classified information all of the time for their own ends. And as long as they're doing it because it politically benefits them, or if they're powerful people in Washington, they don't get punished. The only people who get punished for releasing classified information are low-level, powerless whistleblowers who only get punished because they reveal secrets about what the government is doing illegally and unconstitutionally, and they get punished for having revealed the government's crimes. People like Edward Snowden, who showed the citizenry that the government was unconstitutionally and illegally spying on us. None of the people unconstitutionally and illegally spying got punished. Edward Snowden got punished for revealing that. This is something I've been reporting on for a long time. Now, in the Obama administration, despite all of the claims about him being a civil libertarian, they actually pioneered all new ways to punish whistleblowers, to the point that the Obama administration prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined. The Espionage Act is an act that was enacted in 1917 under Woodrow Wilson to criminalize dissidents of U.S. involvement in World War I. So you have all those presidents through the Cold War and the Vietnam War and John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. All of those together didn't prosecute as many sources and whistleblowers as the Obama administration prosecuted. Here you see PolitiFact in 2014 fact-checking Jake Tapper's statement that, quote, the Obama administration has used the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers who leak to journalists more than all previous administrations combined. And there you see the true sign, because it's absolutely true. So they go after powerless people or people who reveal their crimes. And yet we saw with Russiagate, people like Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell and people in the CIA leaking classified information all the time to the Washington Post and the New York Times, the Washington Post and the New York Times, in order to undermine the Trump presidency, none of whom was ever prosecuted. Do you know that the most serious kind of leaking that you can do under U.S. law is to leak information that the NSA has collected? Meaning, if the NSA spies on foreign leaders and their conversations, one of the most serious crimes is to leak those transcripts, because that will reveal to the targets of NSA spying not only that the NSA is spying on them, but also how they're doing it. In fact, there are very few crimes that journalists can be charged with for leaking. Very few types of documents that journalists can be charged with publishing. In general, journalists cannot be charged or prosecuted just for publishing any kind of classified information. Only a couple of types that are deemed so serious that even journalists can be prosecuted for publishing them. One of those is NSA transcripts. And yet, you may remember that when, in the early part of the Trump administration, they wanted to prosecute Michael Flynn for what they considered the crime of having spoken with Russian officials, including Ambassador Kislyak, someone inside the government, in order to prove that General Flynn did this, took the NSA transcripts. The NSA was spying on these Russian officials and gave them to the Washington Post. The Washington Post published them. The most serious leak of classified information you could have under the U.S. law. Do you know how many people have been prosecuted for that? 0. They never even looked for the person who did that. Why? Because that politically benefited the powers that be in Washington. They were trying to sabotage the Trump administration. It was clearly a leak that came from the U.S. government of the most sensitive kind of classified information, and therefore they immunized the people who did it. Over and over, that's what we saw. You may remember that Obama's CIA director, Leon Panetta, got caught leaking some of the most serious classified information to the producers of the film Zero Dark 30. Zero Dark 30, as you may remember, was a story that Washington was going to tell about how the U.S. government heroically found Osama bin Laden. And they planned to release the film shortly before Obama's 2012 re-election bid, right before the 2012 election. Obama was running on the fact that he got Osama bin Laden. Remember, his phrase was, General Motors lives and Osama bin Laden is dead. That was Obama's claim to a second term. And so they were going to have this film, Zero Dark 30, that glamorized how Obama caught Osama bin Laden. And in order to do that, Leon Panetta, a CIA director, who was refusing any kinds of disclosures about how Osama bin Laden was found to people who were suing to get that information, and even to the Congress, released the most sensitive material to the producers of Zero Dark 30. Here from the AP, Leon Panetta revealed secret information to Zero Dark 30 screenwriter. Newly declassified documents show that the former CIA director disclosed details about the raid that killed Osama bin Laden during his speech he was attending, where he claims he didn't know one of the film's producers was. And it wasn't just any classified information. Here you can see from Politico that Panetta revealed information about the identity of the SEAL officer who was the one who did it. Quote, just we can move that one to the next one. Former CIA Director Leon Panetta revealed the name of the Nazi SEAL unit that carried out the Osama bin Laden raid and named the unit's ground commander at a 2011 ceremony attended by Zero Dark 30 filmmaker Mark Bowl. Leon Panetta was never even charged with any of this, let alone convicted, even though he didn't have any noble motive the way Edward Snowden did or any other whistleblowers did of trying to expose government crimes. He was trying to help Hollywood create a hagiography to help Barack Obama get reelected, and gave them extremely sensitive classified information in order to make this film. But because he did it for reasons that benefited President Obama and the government, he was never charged with leaking classified information, even if it was among the most sensitive kind possible, while they went after low-level leakers and whistleblowers who had noble motives, namely to expose the crimes of the U.S. security state, at a record level. The other case was the case of Obama's CIA director and beloved general, David Petraeus. You may recall that David Petraeus leaked the most sensitive information that the U.S. government has to his girlfriend, to his lover, so that she could write a book about him while he was the CIA director. There you see, David Petraeus pleads guilty for passing classified black books to lover. The black books, as this article says, are among the most sensitive secrets the U.S. government has. He passed them to his lover while he was the director of the CIA. Again, he did so not because he had any noble motives, but he had completely self-interested motives to allow her to write a book about him that made him look good. David Petraeus was allowed to plead guilty not to a felony conviction, but to a misdemeanor count, even though his leaking was among the most sensitive kind for the worst possible reasons, just like Leon Panetta. He got a slap on the wrist, no jail time, and now he went on with his life. Of course, during the 2016 campaign, Hillary Clinton also, as you might remember, kept classified information in a very unsecure manner in her own house on a server. And yet here you see FBI James Comey recommends no charges for Hillary Clinton on the email case, even though while announcing that, Comey admitted that, quote, here you see from the New York Times, he rebuked Mrs. Clinton as being, quote, extremely careless in using a private email address and server. He raised questions about her judgment, contradicted statements she had made about her email practices, said it is possible that hostile foreign governments had gained access to her account, and declared that a person still employed by the government could have faced disciplinary action for what she did. This is the game playing that the U.S. government does constantly with secrecy powers. It uses its secrecy powers, abuses it to hide everything it does from you, to empower the highest level officials to leak classified information of the most sensitive kind for political benefits for leaders, while at the same time they punish people, whistleblowers. The only way that we have left to even learn what the U.S. security state is doing, for not self-interested reasons they're leaking, but for purely noble ones, to inform the citizenry of what our government is doing in the dark. And so that's why I never cared about the Donald Trump case, but I now do most certainly care about the Joe Biden case, because they spent months telling us that what Donald Trump did was of the gravest crime. It imperiled the nation, and now it's time for them to apply that rationale that they applied to Donald Trump to Joe Biden for doing much of the same, if not far worse. For our interview segment, our guest tonight is Aaron Maté, the independent journalist who works at the Gray Zone News. He's also the host of The Pushback Show where, as its name suggests, he conducts adversarial interviews with a broad range of people. His interview of Guardian reporter Luke Harding, who had just written a best-selling book purporting to prove collusion between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin, was one of the most effective interviews I've ever seen for unmasking that story and the people behind it as the complete and utter fraud that it was. There you see it on the screen. If you have a spare half hour, that interview that Aaron did with Luke Harding is on YouTube, and I can't recommend it enough. He meticulously follows the U.S. security state, the war in Ukraine, the ongoing fallout from the Russiagate fraud, and we have a lot to talk to him about tonight about that and a lot more, and we're going to do so right now. Aaron, it's great to see you. I think you were our debut guest when we were kind of rehearsing, so I'm thrilled to have what is now your debut appearance on our real show. Thanks for taking the time to join us.
It's great to be here.
So I want to start with something that I have to confess I feel a little bit embarrassed about. I've been on kind of a crusade to try and convince conservatives and right-wing populists and people concerned about the U.S. security state that they have an ally, the Ilhan Omar, the member of the squad who I keep trying to tell them is the most heterodox and independent-minded of all the members of the squad, maybe even the Democratic caucus. And I was touting the fact that she seemed, in her words, excited about the possibility of this new church committee that the Republicans were planning. Let's show our viewers what it is that she said on this video.
The obviously cuts to the Pentagon budget is pretty exciting for folks like me who are putting up amendments to do so. I also think the church-style committee that they are thinking about to look into if there has been any violations of First Amendment rights of Americans by the FBI and others also interests me. So we'll see what ends up happening and if the Republicans are able to actually be able to get anything done.
Aaron, it excites her, that investigation, and it interests her so much, this church committee. I guess we're going to have to see what ends up getting done. But what ended up getting done is that every single Democrat, every last one of them, including that person we just saw on the screen, Ilhan Omar, ended up voting no against this committee trying to shield the CIA, Homeland Security, the FBI from investigative scrutiny. What do you make of all that?
It reminds me of when Ilhan Omar, early on in the Ukraine proxy war, a few months after Russia invaded, warned that sending billions of dollars to Ukraine and U.S. weapons would be likely disastrous. And I said, great, it's great to see a progressive member of Congress making this point because it was obvious. And then shortly afterwards, when it was time to vote on whether or not to approve those billions of dollars in weapons, Ilhan Omar voted for them and then voted for them again and again and again. And finally, when some anti-war protesters confronted her about it, she scolded them and basically accused them of being Kremlin agents. So this time, I'm not sure what happened in between her saying how exciting it was that we're having this new church committee to investigate the intelligence agencies, and then a few days later voting against that very proposal that she was excited by. But unfortunately, this has become par for the course with our progressives in Congress. And in the case of Ilhan Omar, I share your sentiment. For me, it's especially sad because I personally have a soft spot for her. She's been viciously attacked as a woman of color who wears hijab, who's taken brave stances, for example, on Palestine, where I very much agree with what she said, and she's been smeared for it. And here she is, time and time again, siding with the very forces that have attacked her, especially in voting every time for this proxy war in Ukraine, and now refusing to conduct oversight of the national security state. So it's a shame.
It is. You know, I would love to be able to ask her about that and a lot of other things. I invited her on my show
You won't be able to.
No, I've invited her on my show right before Christmas, and she's like, you know, I'm trying to have some downtime. I don't really want to do any interviews. I then saw her on MSNBC doing friendly interviews with Mehdi Hasan and the like. I then reached out to her again after the new year, as she asked me to do, and she has not yet responded, so I don't think I'll get to pose these questions to her directly. She'll only go on places that won't ask her about that, particularly MSNBC, Democracy Now!, CNN, and the like. So we probably won't have her on our show anytime soon, though we will keep asking. Let me ask you about this church committee, what is being called the new church committee, the subcommittee run by Jim Jordan, designed to investigate certain aspects and abuses of whether these security state agencies have been interfering in our politics. What is it that you think, with regard to Russiagate in particular, a topic that you've covered, I think, better than anybody as a journalist, is something that needs investigative scrutiny from the Congress?
Well, look, if you look at all the major planks of Russiagate, all the conspiracy theories that sustained it for so long, pretty much all of them have been demolished. The collusion aspect, which was the biggest one, the idea that Trump was conspiring with Russia and being secretly blackmailed by Vladimir Putin with compromise, including a P-tape. Nobody serious pays any lip service to that anymore. Certainly
Robert Mueller didn't
MSNBC
even mention that
do.
theory, that he really didn't even bother to debunk it or even mention it.
He claimed it wasn't in his purview. He claimed that the Steele dossier wasn't in his purview, which was actually, the more information we find out, was a lie. It was in his purview. But that aside, so the collusion aspect, nobody takes that seriously anymore. No one tries to argue that Trump is a Russian agent and that there's a conspiracy. The idea that Russia brainwashed millions of Americans into not voting for Hillary and voting for Trump via social media bots and memes, that one is demolished too. And we've gotten a lot of disclosures from the Twitter files showing how Twitter was pressured to validate this claim, even though they had no evidence for it. And just this week, the Washington Post came out with a story saying that actually, yeah, Russian bots didn't have any influence on the 2016 election, which was obvious from the start. If anybody looked at the Russian memes that were put out on Facebook or Twitter, most of them had nothing to do with the election. Most of them came after the election, and they were juvenile. So the idea that they could influence one person not to vote for Hillary Clinton, vote for Trump, was just a joke. But it was able to sustain itself because nobody in media was willing to do their job and look at the actual evidence. So that's done with. The one thing that remains, though, is this allegation of who stole the emails from the Democratic Party and gave them to Hillary Clinton, and gave them to WikiLeaks. Robert Mueller and U.S. intelligence officials claim it was Russia. To this date, we've seen no evidence for it. We've seen some claims, but we haven't seen any underlying evidence. But we've also seen underlying evidence that undermines this claim. For example, the fact that just as the FBI relied on a Clinton campaign contractor, Christopher Steele, to spy on Carter Page and pursue leads in its collusion aspect of the Russia investigation, the FBI also relied on a different Clinton campaign contractor, CrowdStrike, which is the firm, the private firm, that first accused Russia of hacking the DNC and pressured the FBI to validate its claims, even as it refused to let the FBI do its own inspection of the server, even as it spent months delaying to send the FBI images of the server, and even as it gave the FBI redacted reports. So CrowdStrike decided what the FBI could see of its own forensics and investigations of the server. And by the way, who hired CrowdStrike? But Michael Sussman, who was indicted for misleading the FBI and trying to sell them on this concocted claim of a secret Trump-Russia back channel via the Alpha Bank server. So,
yeah,
given
we should add, he was acquitted on very kind of narrow grounds, but no one disputes the fact that the story he brought to the FBI about this connection between the Trump organization and a Russian bank through a secret server was a fraud. That's not why he was acquitted, because that story was true. Everyone acknowledges that's a lie.
Exactly. No one disputes that it was a fraud, and the reason why he was acquitted, you could argue, is because the case was on the wrong grounds. Because, of course, the idea that the FBI was fooled is a joke. The FBI was in on his fraud. So the idea of prosecuting him on the basis of fooling the FBI didn't make any sense, because the FBI was entirely in with him on this fraud, which actually makes the scandal even worse. So given the preponderance of fraud, given the role of Democratic partisan actors in this fraud, and given the fact they hired the firm that generated this foundational claim that Russia stole the DNC emails, and given the fact that CrowdStrike, this firm, admitted under oath that it had no evidence that Russia actually hacked anything, which we only found out about 2 years after Mueller shut down because Adam Schiff sat on that testimony and wouldn't release it to the public. That, to me, is the angle here that needs the most scrutiny. And we can start by releasing the CrowdStrike reports. I've tried to get those through the Freedom of Information Act, and the FBI has denied the existence of those reports. And what they gave me finally was one cover page, and they redacted the rest as if that's somehow sensitive national security information. Why is the work of a private company working for Hillary Clinton national security information? It can only be in that category if the FBI is relying on it, which makes it all the more important for us to see it, because this is a company working for the campaign that drummed up a phony collusion allegation against Trump. So that, to me, is the angle that should be the subject of the most disclosures.
So my guess is there's going to be a lot of focus on those Russiagate questions, the origins of Russiagate inside the FBI, how a lot of the lies that got told, including the Hunter Biden laptop being Russian disinformation, where those came from. But I understand, even though I think it's corrupt, I understand why Democrats aren't interested in having that material surface, because all of those lies benefited the Democrats in all sorts of ways. That was its intention. What I genuinely don't understand is why, when it comes to the broader issues of U.S. security state abuses, what the FBI does, what the CIA does to interfere in our domestic politics, to target anti-establishment voices, why all Democrats, including people like Ilhan Omar, are opposed to it. Now, we've been covering polling data showing that the Democrats really do revere these agencies now, even though being suspicious of the CIA and the FBI and the NSA used to be a staple of left liberal politics. It was out of left liberal politics where the original Church Committee originated and out of which it grew. And yet now you have this kind of notion among Democrats that these agencies are not any longer threatening, but are in fact benevolent. I want to show you a tweet from my former colleague at The Intercept, who before that worked at the New York Times, James Risen, and he said this today. This is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen coming from a journalist. He said, quote, "The deep state remains a myth, a right-wing conspiracy theory, precisely because the Church Committee brought the intelligence community fully under the rule of law and into the American system of government." Now, the idea that the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and Homeland Security are fully under the rule of law since the Church Committee 45 years ago is one of the most inane and inherently laughable things I've ever heard. The fact that it comes from a reporter who won a Pulitzer Prize in 2005 for reporting that the NSA was illegally spying on Americans without the warrants required by law makes it mystifying. Aaron, I do believe, though, that James Risen believes what he's saying. I think he sees these agencies as benevolent the way most Democrats do, and that's why they don't want them being investigated. When did this happen, and why has it happened that these agencies that everybody used to understand were operating in the dark and malicious ways are now beloved by the Democratic Party?
When I first, in my first job in media was at Democracy Now! As a producer, which I joined in late 2005. And one of the first stories I remember working on was James Risen's scoop in the Times about the NSA mass surveillance. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, this is the kind of journalism I want to do. This is inspiring, and this is what journalism should be. But yes, in this Russiagate era, we've seen this cultural shift in media and politics where to be a good liberal, you have to go from what used to be just a bedrock principle of questioning intelligence agencies and national security state to parroting them. And that's because the answer to Trump was presented to us as the FBI and the CIA, that they were the ones protecting democracy. They were the steady state, not the deep state. And what's blown my mind is seeing so many journalists, especially people like Jim Risen, who've exposed abuses by the national security state, now falling in line to sing their praises and to act as stenographers.
They tried to put Jim Risen in prison. He did a story with his source, Jeffrey Sterling, and they tried to force him to tell them who his source was, even though they knew, for a story he did on Iran. And even though they tried to put him in prison, even though he won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing their criminal surveillance of Americans, he's out there saying that everyone knows they operate fully within the rule of law. I mean, it's such a radical and fundamental transformation that I'm genuinely interested in why it happened.
And does he remember when, for example, I mean, you can take so many examples, but when the Senate Intelligence Committee was investigating the CIA torture program, and subjecting the CIA to the rule of law. How did the CIA respond? They spied on the Senate Intelligence Committee. They hacked into their computers.
Under John Brennan.
Under John Brennan, yeah. So what has happened? So basically, it's Trump. Basically, Trump, I think, spooked a lot of people. They got scared of him. They bought into this idea that he was this singular threat, this Hitlerian figure. And so the answer that they were presented of the national security state, they just embraced, and they, in the process, refused to do their jobs of reporting critically on these agencies, and instead have been parroting, and it's led to a series of embarrassments. You can take Jim Risen as an example. He was a dupe of Russiagate, buying into every dumb conspiracy theory, refusing to own up to it, even when, as all the evidence came out from the Mueller report to all the subsequent disclosures, not owning up to buying into really the dumbest conspiracy theory of all time. The idea that the president was really a Russian agent, that back when Trump was hosting The Apprentice, he was somehow recruited by Russia to do their bidding. And the idea that he was doing their bidding, even if you look at his actual policies, he was recklessly escalating tensions with Russia. That's the policy choices that he made. But Russiagate incentivized people like Jim Risen to avoid looking at that, because that went against their conspiracy theory. And then the Russian bounties in Afghanistan, you can go down the list. So it's been an incredibly successful project.
A week before I left The Intercept, because they refused to publish my article about the Hunter Biden laptop and what it reflected about Joe Biden's business in Ukraine and China, on the grounds that my article failed to meet their incredibly lofty editorial standards. The media outlet that I created, my article failed to meet their editorial standards. A week earlier, they published an article by Jim Risen, mindlessly quoting anonymous intel officials saying that the Hunter Biden laptop was, quote, Russian disinformation. There isn't a single lie from the Intelligence Committee that he and The Intercept didn't end up endorsing. And it is just an amazing aspect of our political life that the Democratic Party is now completely united with the U.S. security state, to the point where they're not even willing to give one token no vote from like an Ilhan Omar or somebody, or yes vote, to say, you know what, I kind of do think they should be investigated.
Yeah, look, these people are able to look at people who follow QAnon and see what's going on there, that people in a confusing time are latching on to conspiracy theories to make sense of the world and to give them a sense of community and belonging. Well, they should apply that awareness to themselves, to their own cult, which is called Blue Anon, where to take solace from the fact that Donald Trump was the president and he put a very ugly face on the U.S. state because he was honest. You're not supposed to say when you're the president that we're staying in Syria to take their oil. You're supposed to say we're there to fight terrorism and spread democracy. People who couldn't handle that sought alternative explanations, and that meant believing whatever the national security state told them. That meant blaming everything on Russia, and that meant refusing to do any kind of self-reflection. So what I'm constantly amazed by is no matter how many times these conspiracy theories about Russia and Trump get discredited, there's no self-reflection. And so the media right now is acting as a cult. It's a self-reinforcing cult. And that's why people like us have been pushed out, because we don't adhere to cult orthodoxy.
Yeah, I mean, you know, apocalyptic cults are famous for warning that the doomsday is coming, and they give the exact date on which it comes, and of course the world doesn't end, and then they just kind of readjust the date and say, no, this time it's really ending. And this is kind of what it's been like. Donald Trump, the walls are closing in, we're about to get him, and yet they never have any kind of sense that, hey, maybe we're just looking at the world through the wrong framework. So we're a little bit over time, but I nonetheless want to use your presence here to ask you about a very important topic that has become almost forgotten, despite the fact that there's few things more dangerous on the planet right now, which is the fact that the U.S. continues with escalating amounts of money and more sophisticated weaponry to fuel a proxy war between the two most nuclear-armed states on the planet, Russia and the United States, over Ukraine. We barely ever hear about it anymore. It's kind of something that's just faded into the woodwork. We just accept now that every 3 months or so we send another $40 billion over to Ukraine. No one debates it anymore. Talk about, in your view, where this war is. What has it done to Ukraine, and how are NATO's objectives, as not the propaganda defines them, but as they really are, how are they getting fulfilled?
Well, the best assessment of the state of Ukraine today in my opinion, was put out by Bob Gates and Condoleezza Rice, two former cabinet secretaries, in the Washington Post. And they pointed out that today, Ukraine is basically in a very dire state. Millions of people have fled. Large parts of its rich agricultural and industrial areas are occupied by Russia. It's ever more dependent on Western aid. And militarily, it's suffering heavy losses because it's fighting its next door neighbor, which is one of the most powerful militaries in the world. And their answer to this is to send in more weapons, even though it's widely recognized now that Ukraine does not have any real prospect of regaining the territory that it wants, especially Crimea, which Russia took in 2014, which remains the official Ukrainian war aim. And when you read the accounts in the establishment newspapers, it's explained what the U.S. goal is. Basically, they want to keep pouring in weapons that will keep Ukraine in the fight, but not draw in NATO into the war, because the U.S. doesn't want to fight Russia directly. So the strategy is very cynical, because they recognize that Ukraine can't win, but yet they want to keep pouring in weapons that keep the fight going, but only insofar as it stays inside Ukraine, does not draw NATO in to fight Russia, which means that actually the U.S. is then denying some weapon system that Ukraine says it really, really needs. So on what conditions would it do that? Why would it keep this war going despite the awareness that it doesn't think Ukraine can achieve its goals? Well, the answer is simple. As Lloyd Austin blurted out and then got reprimanded for, but he was telling the truth, the goal is to weaken Russia. It's not to defend Ukraine. It's to weaken Russia. If this was about defending Ukraine,
it's to sacrifice. And the way you weaken Russia is by sacrificing Ukraine. That was clear from the beginning. They were never interested in protecting Ukraine or saving Ukraine. They knew they were going to end up destroying Ukraine. They were willing to sacrifice Ukraine in order to get to their real goal of weakening Russia.
It's openly admitted now. Oliver North, former Reagan official, said recently, "Their blood, our bullets." Lindsey Graham, back in the summer, bragged about, as long as we send in weapons, Ukraine will, quote, fight to the last person. So they don't even hide their contempt for Ukrainian life, which they see as subordinate to the broader goal of using Ukraine to weaken Russia. So I guess they feel as if they can keep the war going for longer, they can bleed Russia more. I mean, it's true that Russia has taken a lot of casualties. So from the point of view of a neocon in Washington, that is a good thing, especially if you have nothing but contempt for the Ukrainian lives that are being lost in the process. And look, it's a long-time goal. The RAND Corporation, a Pentagon-allied think tank, a few years ago had a paper detailing the various ways in which the U.S. could overextend Russia. And the top way they proposed was to send weapons to Ukraine and draw Russia in. And that plan is being fulfilled right now. As the Ukrainian defense minister recently said, we are fulfilling NATO's mission. And NATO's mission is leaving Ukrainians in a really dire state and being killed in mass numbers. And the plan right now is for that to continue.
Yeah, and we should point out that, politically, this is another example where the Democratic Party is in complete unanimous lockstep. Every single last Democrat, including people who warned of the dangers, like Bernie Sanders, who wrote an op-ed in The Guardian right before, warning about the dangers. Ilhan Omar, as you said, did the same. Cori Bush, on the day she voted for it, issued a statement warning about it. But nonetheless, it's a very bipartisan war. As usual, the establishment wing of the Republican and Democratic parties are fully aligned, even though the only no votes are coming from, 7 dozen or so kind of more populist members of the Republican Party. Overwhelmingly, both parties are in support of this war, as is usually the case for the most disastrous foreign policy. So you see the same political dynamic we've been discussing at play here in Ukraine as well. Aaron, I want to thank you so much, as always, for taking the time. Those of you who don't follow Aaron's work should really do so. I particularly recommend watching that interview that he did of Luke Harding. At the time, Luke Harding had the #1 best-selling book. What was the name of that book? Collusion or Proof or something?
Collusion.
It purported to prove for once and for all. And Aaron, all he did was pressed him over and over on where is the evidence proving the collusion, the actual whole point of the book. And when he couldn't give any actual examples, Luke Harding, in frustration, hung up the phone on Aaron. It's one of the best interviews, and it'll make you an addict to Aaron's work, which is, despite being radical, very meticulous and based on the facts. Aaron, thanks again for taking the time. Always enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise. Thanks, Glenn.
Have a great night. So that concludes our show for this evening. We are a little bit over time, but we will nonetheless do what we always do, which is go on to locals now. for our after show. We're going to be there in just a few minutes where we'll take your questions, engage with your feedback, hear your ideas. For those of you who aren't yet Locals members, you can join by clicking the join button in the upper right-hand corner of the page and join our Locals community. You'll be able to get full access to these after shows, as well as the written reporting that I do that will soon exclusively be available only on Locals. For those of you watching, we hope you'll join us tomorrow night and every night, 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern, live exclusively here on Rumble. Have a great night.